I am always so pleased to talk to Johnny. He is, of course, to the design world, either an oracle or a god, someone whose projects, once as chief design officer for Apple, now as the founder of the design collective Love From, are breathlessly awaited and inspire a kind of awe. He is also famously private and rarely heard from, which only adds to his mystique. To his friends, though, and I am so proud to count myself as one of them, Johnny has such warmth and generosity and intelligence. He is, I'd say, a humanist, a delight to talk to, a wonderful father and loving husband to his extraordinary wife, Heather, someone who cares about people as much as he cares about the extraordinary things that he designs. The products he's made, the iPhone, the Apple Watch, we all know the list by now, are brilliant precisely because they have a human scale and an intuitive simplicity and purity that make them feel essential. They're tools, but at this point, they feel more like natural complements to the busy lives that we lead. And of course, none of us know what we would do without them. So it's been 2 years since Johnny left Apple. And I know that we're all so excited to hear about the turns his life and career have taken with Love From, which collaborates not only with Apple, but with brands like Ferrari and Airbnb. And as so much of Love From's work revolves around climate change, I'm especially eager to hear his thoughts on this. Please join me in welcoming Sir Johnny Ive. Johnny, nice to see you again back at a Wired conference. I think it's about 4 years since we talked last, well, at a Wired conference. And these past few weeks have marked several big anniversaries for you. And so today I wanted to ask you about some of them. For starters, 20 years ago, the iPod was launched. You spent most of your career creating devices we hold in our hands or on our desk. And then you moved to devices we wear, like the Apple Watch. What was the biggest challenge in the shift to wearables? And where on earth are all these devices going to go from here?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly been, I can't quite remember a few weeks that have been quite so loaded in terms of important anniversaries that have given me calls to think about the past. These haven't been those sort of dreadfully polite, gentle reminiscences. These have been, I think, really fairly loaded. The iPod, I struggle to really get my head around that it is truly 20 years. I think iPod marked, the beginning of a very new and important chapter for Apple, or as it was pre-iPod, Apple Computer. So up until that point in time, Apple made general purpose computing devices. And one of the powers, I think one of the things that was so unique and special, I think, about the computer was its ability to be general purpose. And I think what the iPod really marked was the beginning of creating far more specific products and devices. Now, it happened at a time, I think, of extraordinary, I think, both opportunity and need. So there were a number of technological affordances that sort of presented themselves in terms of storing lots of data in small physical spaces. But I think the need was that there was almost this sort of existential question about the value of music. This is 20 years ago when people realized they didn't have to pay for music. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was a context or a backdrop for doing something, creating something that was quite important. And I think the iPod really, I think, represents a marriage of I think, innovative and great hardware, software, and services. And from a design perspective, we thought the opportunities were, I think, exciting and compelling, but also this seemed important. And so from a design point of view, the context back, 20 years ago, consumer electronics tended to be, they tended to be plastic objects that were
Extremely
really
clunky.
represented. I know, they tended to be fairly sort of arbitrary in terms of their form. And we honestly felt that there was something so profoundly important about music. And so we wanted to develop a design that somehow acknowledged that gravitas, that this was not another piece of random consumer electronics. And so I think that started with, first of all, treating it as a single system. So, the headphones were, we thought about them in terms of being part of the same product, being the actual player device. We developed a new sort of palette of materials that range from double shot plastic, but to polished stainless steel that was laser etched. We did a ton of work on not only the materials, but also just on the color. I mean, now it seems obvious, with the benefit of hindsight, it seems obvious that the headphones would be white. I remember 20 years ago, the sort of shock and resistance to, why would you possibly call attention to these headphones that I saw as like these little white flags that spoke to, the one visible part of the system. So, the other thing I think was that we wanted to try and create a design that was so distinctive that it didn't require a logo and a name on the front, which is unheard of. 20 years ago in consumer electronics, you couldn't move for shouting about logo and the company that made it. And I think what happened, and this happens occasionally, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes a design can assume, as you know, a sort of a momentum where it assumes a sort of a cultural gravity and significance, and what we started to hear about it referred to as an icon. But this did mark, I think, the beginning of moving away from what was general purpose to something that was more specific in what it did and more specific in who it did it for. So it was a personal device that was, we started to see people wearing our products.
I always remember thinking about logos and icons. I always remember the first time I came to visit you in your incredible headquarters at Apple, and you were adamant that there shouldn't be a shop, that you didn't want to have a shop, but that you said that you had realized that actually everybody wanted to buy that coffee mug with the Apple logo. So what did you ever do about the shop? Did you have it in the end or not?
No, we do. I mean, Apple Park, there is actually a fantastic visitor center. And as part of the visitor center, you can buy your mugs with the Apple logo on.
Yeah, but I seem to remember you were very, very against it. So obviously that was 20 years ago. If we look forward to 20 years from now, Johnny, what do you think wearable devices will be? What do you think that the future is for them?
Well, I think what really, in many ways, I think Apple's journey began in the 70s to make what was incredibly powerful technology personal with the personal computer. And I think that trajectory, that journey started then. And then I think there are these salient moments along the way that mark the the capability, the technology becoming more specific and more personal. So I think the iPod was a terribly important marker on that journey. I think another significant one was the Apple Watch. So as the technology becomes more powerful, but also physically becomes smaller, and that it is possible for it to be worn simply and worn easily, the products become clearly not only more personal, but they become more intimate. And I think, I mean, there's no doubt, and I know you and I have talked about this in the past, there are, without question, some of those products will disappear beneath our skin. I can't think of anything more personal, more specific, more individual, and more intimate than things being inside us. But that's not going to be all of the products, obviously. I mean, while we remain physical beings and while we remain in a physical world relating to one another, while we have our eyes and our hands, we will also want to relate beyond ourselves. And so there's, I think, going to be categories and categories of products that, while I think they will be more intimate and more personal, but they will be worn outside of our skin.
Right, right. Well, we also talked a lot about how we could make the Apple Watch smaller. That was something you were really challenged by. Something that I would love to see one day. But 10 years ago, Johnny, the world lost your creative partner, Steve Jobs, who you referred to as the most inquisitive human I have ever met. And I read that amazing tribute that you wrote to him recently in the Wall Street Journal. So what do you miss most about him? The conversations, the person, the creativity?
Yeah, it's been an interesting process, and I'm sure it's one that many of us can relate to. I think perhaps rather naively, I thought my sense of Steve, when I remember him and think about him, which is pretty much every day, I thought my sense of him would remain somehow inviolate and stable. And what surprised me is, as I think about him, my sense of him, my sense of what his contribution truly was, has grown and has evolved. And I think that's a comment on a number of things. I think not least the sort of the current situation and context that we've been living through in the last few years. But I think where I have seen this shift in my own sense and my own remembering of him was less about his achievement, less about his the products of his process, but it's become more and more about how he worked and the values and the priorities that he had in his working. And so, as I described, I've never met anybody more truly curious, more inquisitive than Steve. And what, I mean, those are easy words and they can be used fairly glibly, but he was constantly questioning. He wasn't defined by anybody else's dogma. There was this relish, this celebration of being surprised, even if the surprise actually meant that he was wrong. He was far more interested in the learning than being right. And it was that love of and that almost childlike wonder of discovering and questioning. But I think with some space, I realize, and this has influenced me so very much, I think it's very easy to think, well, you know, that can just be an innate personality trait, to be curious. And over the last sort of decade or so, I've become increasingly aware of actually just how much intention is required. If you don't want to just fit in to, I guess, the status quo, or just fit in a nice, polite, convenient way, that large groups of people tend to sort of push you towards. And I've become more and more aware of the intention, the resolve, and the determination to be truly curious, to be truly, questioning. I think what happens is that when we're in a group of people, we tend to want to talk about what's known because it's much easier to have a polite conversation. I don't think most people, I think, don't relish confrontation, and they want to establish some sort of connection with other people. And that's very hard to do in a large group if what you're talking about is partial and tentative. If it's just a nebulous, fragile idea, that's a much more difficult conversation than talking about the problem. Because I think the thing with problems, by definition, a problem is understood. And so, of course, people want to talk about what they understand. And so generally the problem consumes the oxygen. It takes all of the attention. And I am more and more struck by how much energy and effort that he put in to encouraging people to be comfortable talking about what's tentative and partial, and that's ideas. And his just innate respect and reverence for the creative process was extraordinary. And I don't know, the older I get, the more important both the contribution and, I don't know, the sort of the moral imperative around creating seems to, personally seems to be the case. And so, yeah, I am particularly mindful of just his attitudes and his thinking, perhaps more than the predictable achievements.
Listening to you, Johnny, I'm wondering if this was these thoughts were in your mind when you left Apple and formed Love From. And I'd love to understand what made you choose that name. And could you tell us, I know a lot of it you can't tell us, but can you tell us more about the motivation and the people behind the company? And I believe an enormous amount of the work that you're doing now is connected to climate change. But how much of it was spurred by all those extraordinary, moving descriptions you just gave us of Steve? Were they connected to the decision to create this company?
No, I mean, that's a great question. I think, and of course, it's always a question of when, not if. And so the timing felt right for me to change the nature of my relationship with Apple. I still work very closely with my friends at Apple. They're one of the collaborators that we're working with. But yes, without a doubt. I mean, in terms of where the name came from, I was always struck by how often we talk about what we do and how we do it, but we don't often talk about why. And I'm personally, when I'm trying to, whether it's me interviewing or as I'm trying to establish some sort of sense of a relationship with somebody, I'm always personally intrigued by what their motivation is. And I will never forget Steve describing the why. And he said that, when you make something, when you create something, and you do it with care, and you do it with love, you may never meet the person that is going to use what you've made. You may never know their name, their story. You probably won't even shake their hand. But if you create with a genuine care and love, it is a way, and I love the way he expressed this. It's a way of expressing our gratitude for the species. And I just thought that the profoundly important nature of our motivation would be a good starting place for a description of who we are. And so that's where the name Love From really came from. The company, I think, is an unusual one because it really is just the very, it's the gentle gathering of, I think, some extraordinary creatives, and it's a diverse group of creatives. We're designers, architects, engineers, writers, mathematicians, musicians, filmmakers. The thing that seems to connect us, I think, is that we are, we may be known by the work that we've done in the past, but I think that we are genuinely connected and united because we believe that our most important work, our most important contribution is in the future. And there is a real passion and belief there, but also a real passion and belief in the value of collaborating with a diverse group of creatives. Our work really sort of falls into three categories. I mean, we have one category of work where we're working very close to founders, leaders, in a sort of a multi-year relationship. So, that's Airbnb, Apple, Amazon Collective. We just recently announced Ferrari. But what's exciting about these relationships is that they're more about a relationship that transcends individual projects, but they are long-term. And I think the value there is the right project in 5 years' time isn't obvious right now. And I've always loved, that as a context, which is a deep relationship with a group of people. The second category of work and projects that we're involved in really is purely for the love, purely for the joy, purely for the belief that we can be useful. And that's very project-based, and is incredibly diverse. I mean, it ranges from designing urban garden systems to working with friends at, for example, Montclair. It involves us working with His Royal Highness Prince Charles on the Terra Carta. And there are sort of half a dozen projects we're working on, which I would love to talk about. Irritatingly, I can't.
Have a Love From puffer jacket from Montclair?
Oh, that just the beginning. But as you said, we with huge intention, almost without exception, all of our work is either very directly or indirectly, but all of our work, almost without exception, is trying to make a contribution to the crisis that we're facing relative to climate change. And I think we are, this little group that we've assembled, we are hoping that we can be in some way useful in a number of different ways, but we are excited about being useful and joining what is clearly I've been very struck by the diverse collection of people who have made this their life's work.
So you're a collective. You're a collective.
So we are,
it's-
and you know, you know some of my dear friends who I'm lucky enough to be working with, but the collective ranges from the legend that is Mark Newson to the legend that is Peter Saville. But as I said, there is a sort of a serenity or calm in that. You know, I think many of us are known by what we have done, and we are much more interested, though, in what we could do. And I think we do believe that we can do so much more, particularly if we are working together.
Together, yeah. Well, I think it's been such an interesting past couple of years, Johnny, and everybody re-evaluating, you know, what it is they want to do with their lives, what they want to do for other people around them. And I'm just, obviously you thought about Love From before COVID, but has COVID hastened your desire to put your work out into the world? Has it changed the values that you had in your mind when you started it? I mean, we've had people, I think I was reading that 2.5 million people quit their jobs in August just because they wanted to do something completely different. Obviously, you were ahead of the curve, but I'm wondering, as we emerge from COVID, what is it that's top of your mind as you start to think about all this extraordinary work that you'll be doing?
No, I mean, that's a wonderful question. It's a very big question. I think the last sort of year and a half that we've lived through, I think highlights some fairly significant challenges for us. I do think I've been interested for a long time in the relationship with, you know, between what is digital, virtual, and what is material and tangible. I mean, it's interesting, the first shipping product from Love From, very intentionally, but perhaps rather surprisingly, is a typeface. And we developed a typeface. I mean, we've been working on this typeface fanatically and with such care and love, but for over 2 years. But it's a typeface based on work that a typographer, John Baskerville, developed over 200 years ago. And we managed to track down the original steel punches from the 1700s. And we scanned and redrew all of the characters. The typeset now has over, I think it's over 7,000 distinct characters, symbols, in a range of different styles. But what's been so interesting is that I think it's a lovely comment on our huge respect and deference to the traditions and the excellence of the past, but combining that with a belief about the importance of the future. And I also think it's a nice comment on our struggles and preoccupation between the physical world, between those 200-old steel punches, and the design of a typeface that is also infinitely controllable in terms of varying optical sizes, weights, in the digital world. So I think one of the things that has so struck me, I mean, one of many, but has been the slight confusion and, of course, the anxiety that's consequent as we struggle to understand what is virtual and digital and what is material. And as you know, I mean, I've always been, like I think many designers, applied artists, I've always been a keen student of process. I've always spent a lot of time looking at how I work. I mean, in some ways it's very selfish. It's for my sanity to be able to cope with those times when ideas neither come or they're just appalling. But one of the things that has become so clear, while I am so grateful for our virtual and digital communication, the danger is it's now so good in so many ways that we make that dreadful mistake of thinking that it is in some way a surrogate for actually being together in person. And as a creative person, you know, those sorts of very transactional, tactical ways of being together are great for a whole bunch of activities. But to try and do something new, to create something new, to think in a different way, it's really quite challenging, isn't it? I mean, I think a huge part of the creative process, a big component of being curious and inquisitive, is learning to actually listen, to ignore
Well,
the usual.
You were talking about the quietest voice in the room.
It's so funny. I mean, if you're on a virtual video call and you're trying to encourage people to listen and everybody's quiet, we assume there's an audio problem. So to just be quiet and to enjoy being quiet and to listening and to think, video connections like these do not encourage us to be quiet and thoughtful. And I think, going back to my recollections and thinking about Steve, some of the most important times we spent were probably on walks together where neither of us said very much, but we were thinking in proximity to each other.
Yes.
And that's the beauty of ideas, isn't it? That they can come very quietly. I think almost always, in my experience, the most powerful ideas do occur quietly, and they are fragile. And they need to be, with reverence and respect, gently cared for as they evolve to become powerful. And I've always loved that sort of strange disconnect between something that eventually can be so powerful, but started so gently, and in such a sort of a tentative, partial way.
Johnny, you are an extraordinary father, and you have the most extraordinary two boys that are really a credit to you and to Heather. And I wonder, when you think of the kind of world that they're going to inherit, how do you think about making it a more hopeful place for them? Because I know their future is so important to you.
Well, thank you, first of all. Yeah, I mean, I hope the world is in one piece for as they grow up. They're both absurdly creative, and as you know, a consequence of that practice is that you have to be optimistic and faithful, and so they have such an affirming and very positive view of the future. I think, sometimes I have to bite down and keep my, how consumed I am with anxiety. I try and hide that from them. I hope that there is a way that we can regard and place these very powerful technologies and tools that we have. I hope we can find the right place for them in our personal lives and in our collective lives. I think this is not a new challenge. I mean, those tools that are the most powerful, that I believe have the potential to be the most helpful, so often we look into we look at history, they can be the most destructive. And I think one of the challenges that we have at the moment is that we are moving so quickly. I think we are struggling to comprehend, to understand both the tremendous power of these tools, And we are struggling to understand the responsibility and perhaps the frameworks that we need to create to try and encourage these tools and opportunities to be used usefully, and to try and reduce the instances of them being used in a negative way. But so I think I'm hugely encouraged that the tools and opportunities are there to help us. It's just our attitudes towards them. But I do hope that the world the boys grow into, I hope there's just a little bit more surprise and wonder, and just an awful lot less cynical dogma. I hope it's a world where there is just a natural enthusiasm and interest in ideas, and there is more of a rejection of just yet another opinion masquerading as fact or as truth or as even as useful as an idea. But I go back to that behavior that we often say is childlike. And I mean, our children are curious, they're inquisitive, and they want to learn. And we've got to figure out a way of not having that lovely predisposition to be curious and inquisitive educated out of them.
Well, Johnny, I'm sure that their lives are filled with surprise and wonder. And we also look forward to seeing all the magical things you're going to create from Love From. I'm especially excited about my Montclair jacket and more things to come. And I love you. I miss you. I'll see you soon.
I'll see you soon, and lots of love. Thank you so much.